Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Paul, and in this GameCube video, we're going to be discussing various pieces of news concerning Nintendo's upcoming Switch, including the fact that it supposedly will support Nintendo GameCube games via backwards compatibility, and also some comments regarding the battery life of the system. And we're also going to go through a series of leaks concerning MSI's 200 series of gaming-focused motherboards, which naturally will be for Kaby. In fact, let's go through that first because it's the quicker of the two pieces of news, and then we'll focus heavily on the Switch. So these leaks concerning the motherboards originate from EXP reviews, and I have to admit I am quite a fan of MSI's aesthetics when it comes to motherboards, and full disclosure, we did review the Gaming M7 and we absolutely loved it, which of course was 100 series based for Kaby. Now, in this particular case, there are two iterations of the board that we've seen leaked. The first is the MSI Z270 Gaming M7 and the Z270 Tomahawk motherboard. So the Gaming M7 is the more expensive of the two, while the Tomahawk is slightly more budget orientated, but it doesn't mean it's cheap. So let's start out with the bigger of the two boards, the Gaming M7. Now, once again, as you can imagine, it features the traditional black and red bold colour scheme, which MSI are pretty infamous for at this point, and will, of course, be adorned with more LEDs in your Christmas tree. And it looks like it's built with a pretty good build quality. I will say that some board partners, like, for example, MSI and Asus, typically, they have had a few pretty bad boards, but generally they are pretty damn reliable. So, the most noticeable thing here you're going to see is a 12-phase PMW supply, and the fact that the rear I/O ports are shielded. And on top of all of that, the VRMs and pretty much everything else are loaded with very beefy looking heat sinks and pipes. So in theory at least, you're not going to start seeing this board heat up particularly high if you overclock. Also rather nice is the fact that you've got a series of buttons at the bottom right, which means you can turn on the board and all the other bits and pieces without needing to worry about the headers attached, which is quite handy if you're tweaking or building the system and perhaps you just want to test it with a bare bones setup. For example, you've just put in a stick of RAM, maybe a basic graphics card and the CPU, and you just want to test, okay, is everything booting? It's quite handy like that without needing to connect everything in, and this is particularly nice in a more cramped case. There will also be the pretty standard by now 4 DIMM slots for DDR4 memory, which supports up to 4,000 megahertz, which is absolutely bonkers if you're from the early 2000s era or even before, as well as PCIe 3.0 16 slots. There are 3 of those, so you should have pretty much no issue whatsoever in terms of multiple graphics solutions. And there are also 3 PCIe times 1 slots. So obviously for devices which don't need quite as much performance, you've got those. Perhaps the most interesting of the additions to this board, however, are 3 M2 slots, as well as a U2 port, which is for the NVMe breed of SSDs. Now, as I've discussed quite a few times on the channel, one of the issues with SSDs at the moment is that if you're buying it for a standard SATA 3 port, you're going to run into bandwidth constraints of the port, and it's not really going to be able to maximize the performance of the SSD, which is one of the reasons that various companies now are starting to switch more, focusing their product lines towards these new standards. So obviously the Intel 200 series will support completely and utterly the 6th generation and the 7th generation of processors, which of course will be Skylake and Kaby respectively. Now, we'll also spend a few moments going through the Tomahawk. So it's very similar in terms of colour scheme, but with a couple of noticeable differences. The 12-phase PMW design is switched down to just a 10, and we also have a familiar DDR4 slot configuration with a limitation of capacity up to 64 gigabytes. You've still got the same number of PCIe slots, which is absolutely fantastic, but you also get the PCIe 1.0, I keep saying 1.0 times 1 port, but the main issue for folks who perhaps need a lot of hard drives attached is that while you still get 6 SATA 3.0 ports, MSI have seen to cut down the M.2 ports just down to 2. So obviously that's quite a reduction. But they do have Lightning USB X Boost, which is a very marketing-y name, but there you have it. This basically increases the amount of bandwidth available over a USB 3.1 connection to about 1 GB per second, which is considerably higher, at least in theory, than even the Thunderbolt is capable of, which is kind of insane. Now, obviously, at the end of the day, if you've already got a decent Skylake platform and you've got a 6700, then you're probably not super interested in any of this. But if you're yet to take the plunge and you're still stuck with, let's say, a Sandy Bridge, then you're very interested most likely in what's going to happen between the Kaby Lake series and possibly the AMD Zen. Now, let's switch to Camp Nintendo. So, Nintendo have had quite a lot of criticism when it comes to the Switch in 2 areas. One was early reports that the battery life on the development kits sucked, and that's me putting it nicely. However, there is a video and other rumours which have swelled up with the normal insiders online, so how much stock you want to put into that is down to your personal take on things. But supposedly, the final console is going to have a battery life between 5 to 8 hours, which I admit is kind of a wide gulf. I mean, 5 to 8 hours is quite a difference, because I'm assuming it's going to depend on how taxing a test you're choosing the Switch to run. So I'm assuming, for example, if you're trying to play the rumoured Dark Souls series, which is going to be Switch bound, it's going to consume a lot more energy than if you're just sitting there on, like, the dashboard, which is fair enough. And slightly off topic, but the final development kits are supposedly now in the hands of the developers. So basically they should, at least in theory, know what the hell they're developing on the system, which is pretty standard. Development kits usually appear in the final development kits usually appear in the hands of developers 3-4 months before the launch of a console, typically. Before that, they're using either very rough facsimiles of the hardware or pretty accurate but not quite accurate facsimiles of the hardware. And we've all heard that for quite some time developers were using, for the PlayStation 4 for example, or the Xbox One, they were using PCs with roughly the equal amount of graphics card power in them, which obviously was GCN based, and various iterations of AMD CPUs. They were using FX 8000 series and God knows what else, and even the original Xbox had folks actually concocting things and hacking things together with bloody laptops. So it's just pretty standard, par for the course for the industry. But anyway, the last thing I want to discuss in terms of the Switch, and perhaps the more interesting of the 2 pieces of news, at least in my opinion, are GameCube games on the Virtual Console. Now, multiple sources have confirmed to both Eurogamer, although they are, as usual, not wanting to reveal their identities, which is pretty obvious considering they don't want to perhaps lose their jobs. However, Emily Rogers, who has been notorious for leaks of the Switch, has also added, "I heard good things about the Switch Virtual Console, step in the right direction. Nintendo is listening to, quote, criticisms about Wii U emulation, end quote." So, what can we expect if there are indeed GameCube games coming to the Switch, supposedly for launch as well? Well, the big ones include Super Mario Sunshine, Animal Crossing, Luigi's Mansion, which is actually kind of cool because it was one of the GameCube's launch games, and also Super Smash Bros. Melee, and perhaps the title which is most interesting is, at least for many, is Smash Bros. Melee, because obviously it's got quite the following in the fighting game community. We can also assume that because the Switch does not have a disc drive at all, and the fact that Nintendo have already confirmed that it will not be backwardly compatible with the Wii U or any other of their consoles with physical media, they're going to really push towards the virtual console. Now, I've kind of got two opinions of that. It's great in one respect because, you know, more games. The only issue is if you've already bought a pretty big back catalogue of titles on the GameCube or whatever, and you do want to take them on the go with you to the Switch, then that does suck. However, realistically speaking, putting a disc in and moving it around is not ideal, especially when the discs weren't originally putting a disc for that in, so there is that issue. And obviously, with moving parts and goodness knows what else, it does consume a lot more battery life, which wouldn't be ideal from the perspective of the Switch. So my personal take on this is I would also like to see more of the GameCube games, which I personally loved, because, well, you know, that's how we are. One of those being Metroid Prime. I've mentioned a couple of times over that Metroid Prime was one of my favourite games on the GameCube. I mean, I freely admit, before the GameCube, I hadn't really played on a Nintendo console. I mean, obviously I'd played on the SNES or Super Nintendo or whatever you want to call it, previously a little bit around friends' houses, and I had done the same for the N64. In fact, I borrowed a friend's N64 complete with, I believe it was Perfect Dark, GoldenEye, and a couple of other titles, but I never really owned a Nintendo console by myself. And the first real experience I had of Metroid was actually Metroid Prime. So, for me, there was like this magical moment on the first, I don't know, half an hour to an hour, let's say, of gameplay of Metroid Prime. And I still maintain it's one of the best titles available, not just on the system, but it's possibly one of my favourite games of that generation. As soon as I think of, you know, the PS2, the Xbox, the Dreamcast, the GameCube, the 6th generation, in other words, I think to myself, yeah, Metroid Prime, and I could probably put it in one of my top 10, maybe top 20 games of that generation. Absolutely phenomenal. So let's hope that we see Metroid Prime appear on the Virtual Console as well. Anyway, I think that's just about it for this particular video. Hopefully you found it interesting, informative, something or another. I don't know, something. Usual things, like, share, comment, subscribe, you know, that'd be pretty damn swell. But I'll see you all soon. Take care of yourselves. Bye.